Good morning. Today, Ms. Caenisha Warren will share the message from Isaiah chapter 58, 11 to 12, and Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 to 14. I will read in Swahili and Sarah will read in English. Hear the word of the Lord. Naye Bwana atakuongoza daima, ataishibisha nafsi yako mahali pasipokuwa na maji, na kuitia nguvu mifupa yako. Nawe utakuwa kama bustani iliyotiwa maji, na kama chemchemi ambayo maji yake hayapungui. Na watu wako watapajenga mahali palipokuwa ukiwa. Utainua misingi ya vizazi vingi, nawe utaitwa mwenye kutengeneza mahali palipobomoka, na mwenye kurejesha njia za kukaa.
The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in his sun-scorched land, and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will rise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorers of streets with dwellings.
Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 to 14. Musa akawaambia watu, msiogope, simameni tu, mkauone wokovu wa Bwana atakaowafanyia leo. Kwa maana hao wa Misri mliowaona leo, hamtawaona tena milele. Bwana atawapigania ninyi, nanyi mtanyamaza kimya.
Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will no longer see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning, Rainer Avenue. It's good to be here. I don't go out and speak or preach very often, and when I do, it's by invitation through relationships. So you can thank Derek Kamwesa as to the reason why I'm here and why I said yes. But this morning, the message that I have for you this morning is not going to be your typical sermon. It's not prescriptive. It doesn't have answers written into it. I'm wanting to take you on more of an exploration. And so this is a little bit different for me, but as my message, the process into my message, to be open to where God is leading. And so this is where I'm landing. And so today I want us to explore, kind of centering on the question is if we know the God who is faithful, the God who's with us, then why are we so afraid to follow God into the change, into new things? So let me pray as we open. Gracious God, Emmanuel, God with us. We ask that your spirit and your word be brought here and your leading would be in the midst of our time together this morning. Be over my being, be over my sharing. Be within us to receive and to hear, to be and to do and to become. In Jesus' name, amen. So just in terms of guiding questions maybe to give you as we began our pondering, in light of where you guys are as a community and looking at Isaiah, I want to ask, where do passions for inclusiveness and neighborly needs make itself evident in how you do church and how you are being church in your community? And how have you used your faith tenets to stand up, take action, and create justice? And so as you leave here from that today, take some of these questions. I'm going to be giving you a lot of questions to discern today. My method of being is a lot of self-reflection and process, and with that comes with question. And I believe that more than answers, questions lead us to the right way and lead us to their answers. And this process of engaging a question might be more important than the answer that we get to. So as I invite you into our little exploration, I know that many of us, or all of us, in our community, our workplaces, our churches, and our worship spaces, but also even in our friendships and our family relations, We're kind of in a state of rebuilding and recommuning, remembering of our collective bodies as a community as we're coming through a pandemic, right? And coming out of that. The pandemic has left kind of no stone unturned, no system untouched, and all manners of being and behaving have been disrupted. And as we look ahead, there are things we know that still need to change, right? There are things we know that we do not want to return to. And as we stand in the midst of present and impending change, there is an illuminating presence that is kind of without definition, without clarity, and without even agreement about what moving forward is going to look like, what it should look like, and what it could look like. There's an unknown and unpredictable future that is even more before our eyes, I would say, and in the grasp of our destinies that is unlike we may have sensed in a while. It is quite uncertain and undetermined, and yet at the same time, it is so present to the taste of our mouths that we are watering at the taste of an almost something that has only yet to be seen, yet to be experienced, yet to be thought of. It's an almost something that comes by the way of newness, and almost something that is the sense of possibility, a something of the Spirit, a something that is about the fullness of God. But what the pandemic has taught many of us is that what was the most present way of being, of doing, of operating, of communing, of systeming, which I know is not a word, but preachers take liberties all the time. All to say, these things have proven a little insufficient, lacking much. It may no longer be reasonable to be in them, and still in so many ways they remain unjust. And there are many ways that we can just that we can't just go back to what was and what will be and what can be, but what should be is also not yet here. Perhaps we are more in a season of the now and the not yet than ever before. Isaiah calls us, though, into this in-between place, I believe, where the community in the passage is recommuning. They're coming back together, returners, remainers. It is being rebuilt, reconfigured, and reconstructed. So there's a coming together of what was, but also what is, and what could be. It's not without troubles or conflicts, so there are questions, there's confrontations, there's tensions and injustice, and the need to self-check, self-reflect, and self-regulate. In fact, it is a coming together that requires, as the scripture says, the need for repairers and restorers. There's a calling out to this community for engaging a fast against injustice through practices of authentic, intentional worship as a way of being with God and being with each other, though, in worship to God. It is putting into perspective and putting into alignment our actual conduct in community, in conduct of community, and the intention expressed in our worship, much like we experience here this morning. The encouragement is to be with God and be with each other in the same way that Jesus has and continues to be present with each of us, both in specific, but also in all-encompassing ways. It highlights how a spiritual discipline, maybe in a medium or pathway of like fasting, can reflect as an indicator of our worship. But a true worship that is genuine, vulnerable, honest, one that is both being and becoming, that is discussing and doing. Here the intention matters because intention impacts us in worship. In a community like this, community has become impacted by the intentional worship that we bring even into this space this morning. This is like, I work for an organization, educational organization, so it's like when our organizations, even our churches or other institutions, may say, we hold these values and principles and goals, but the results of those and such should be embodied in the policies and the practices and the stewardship, right? So I know there are many conversations as we bring into this space in the present of the here and now. They're taking place also about the revival that is happening at Ashbury, this Spirit-led, filled place. And I have seen many justice leaders kind of speak towards an alignment of worship and justice, much like Isaiah focuses on. And a Latino worship leader, who's a preacher and activist, Sandra Van Opstel, posted, "Worship doesn't lead to a life of justice, or worship that doesn't lead to a life of justice is not true worship." So in this present revival that is amongst us, we hope to see the fruits of that and the justice in our lifetime. We must long for spiritual transformation that leads to justice and change. So with our practice of worship and our disciplines of fasting and Sabbath, as they may be at their core, is for building community as part of embodying kingdom, as part of embodying the kingdom of God. So Isaiah calls for fasting, but it calls this worship and calls this to be witnesses towards justice, a fasting, a worship, a justice, as said, that looses the chains and the strongholds of inequality, right? Releases burdens, frees the oppressed, ends exploitation. It gets to the things about sharing and community as well, as a way of defining what community is, what it could be, what it should be, one that shares food with the hungry, gives shelter to the poor, and clothes the naked. It points to spaces of inclusiveness between groups, and is also a preconditioning us towards neighborliness. This idea of being neighborly or being in our neighborhoods, right? I can speak a little about this only because I am of the Mr. Rogers neighborhood generation. You know, it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. But I'm also, in my vocation working, I work at the John Perkins Center. And so a student of Dr. Perkins and the 3 R's and other CCD principles who focus on and look at what it means to be a good neighbor. But what I know about this community as a justice-minded community, I feel like we know what it is that should be done. So we can look up the CCD principles for homework, but I don't feel like that's what has called me here today. And so what grabbed my focus about community and what it now means to be community is in the verses 11 and 12. And I think it talks about a God with us, Emmanuel, and about a faithfulness. So the Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like well-watered garden, like a spring whose water never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets and dwellings. In a different version, New King James Version, the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your soul in drought and strengthen your bones. And you will be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. Those among you shall build the old waste places. You will rise up in the foundations of many generations, and you shall be called repairers of the breach and restorers of the streets to dwell. Now this tells me of a God who is near, and Emmanuel, God with us, and about a promise, saying that the Lord will guide you always, continually. The Lord will guide you, like as we think about our passage in Exodus, like across the sea in exile or through a desert. And in fact, like a desert, it says a sun-scorched land, parched place. It will strengthen you, will give strong bones, will give life in the midst of things where water is life, well-watered garden, a spring that never runs dry. You will rebuild in this space, in this place, with God who is with you. You will rebuild and restore ruins and foundations, so maybe some of the lessons and foundations from the past that is calling us into being community into the future, and rebuild and renovate in the newness of what that means, even in the unknown and sometimes less familiar spaces for the sake of raising future generations, so that we may become repairers and restorers, closing gaps and loosening the chains of injustice, making space where we live in community together. This specific promise and call to this memory and this movement of the Spirit with Israel drew me in. It asked of me, why must we consider this? What does it mean to consider this promise in the face of rebuilding community? In the space of envisioning a future for our community? What does it mean to consider this promise when we think about what is to come and what will be, and in the space of the here and now and the not yet? It's in this unknown and maybe unfamiliar, undetermined future that makes us uncomfortable, I would say. We have seen as we get into this space and spaces of discomfort, sometimes it makes us settle into spaces of exclusion instead of inclusion, when inclusion, by the way, is the way of the kingdom. It makes us grasp for power and knowledge as a way and as a sense of control. And it ultimately makes us uncertain. And we're uncomfortable. We don't like uncertainty as much. But it also, in that uncertainty and in our discomfort, that it makes us less imagined about the possibility, about what is possibility. The possibility that is possible with God, even if it is impossible with humanity, as Luke says. So I began to wonder, are we so fearful of what is actually possible with Christ in the face of what we do not know and have not experienced? Are we so fearful because we are too familiar, maybe too beholden to or too dependent on, maybe too exclusive towards our past and the known way of being, so known that it has come to define for us what it means to be faithful? But instead of stepping out into the promise and maybe the mystery of what is to come with God, we sit and we take camp in what is proven evident and what has been gained. In this verse, there's a reminder that comes about their immediate past, about who they had been and what they had been brought through and what became fulfilled in the promise. But this reminder, though, I feel is more of a reminder about God. Who God is, God the guide, right? This God of the exile, this God in the sun-scorched land, the God who strengthens, who gives water as life, who restores and repairs breaches and calls us to do the same. But most importantly, this God guide is a God who is with us, the God of a promise fulfilled. God was with them. He guided them continually. God satisfied their needs. God strengthened them. God gave water that is without fail. And so this same God is the one who we must not forget when we look towards what is to come. This reminder says God is with us in the here and now, and God is with us and will be with us along as we forge into the not yet and the what is to come. So I think as an encouragement, this brought out to me what faithfulness, God with us, faithfulness. It is a move with faithfulness built on this promise of who God is, Emmanuel, God with us. It is a faithfulness that is God and a faithfulness that comes from God. And it is also a faithfulness that then asks of our participation in it. From our passage in Exodus, we have Moses saying to the Israelites as they are about to cross the Red Sea, and their battle, but reassuring the Israelites, and he says, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." And in the end, he says, "The Lord will fight for you, and you only need to be still." So this too is a narrative of Emmanuel, God with us. God standing present with Moses and Aaron in their call to leadership in this process. Present with the Israelites and God's promise of freedom, and present with Pharaoh even in his fear and opposition to God's people. A story that is of a God of purpose, a God of preparation and providence, a God of passion and presence, and a God of power and fight, a God of the people. The Israelites had spent years being enslaved, right, and brought into the moment of their freedom. In the camp by the Red Sea, they are being pursued and they become scared. and dismayed a little. So their vision of freedom gets called into question, and they view their enslavement, therefore, as a little bit more familiar than this battle that is approaching to their freedom. And so we are often drawn then to what we know in certain times. In the face of battle, they protest to Moses, why? Why? And Moses reminds them of God's presence and says, God will fight for you. And truthfully, the fight didn't come how they expected or imagined, trudging through the wilderness. But sometimes in our places of hardship, we can be both desperate for aid and relief, but also at the same time so dug into our present reality, unable to see our circumstances, see beyond our circumstances, and see out of our circumstances. There was a lack of trust with the Israelites, and there was much then that the Israelites needed to let go of as they were being reminded. So I had to ask myself, I'm a big self-reflector, like the Israelites, what am I distrustful of God to be present in, to provide for, and to protect from? In what ways am I distrustful of institutions like the one I work at or like the church, right? And then I also like to think institutionally or communally. And so for the institution, as an institution, I want to ask, what are we in bondage to? And so beholden to in our operation, our identity, our purpose, that is serving as being more familiar and therefore more trustworthy than the possibilities of a new and perhaps unknown, even inconceivable future that God may actually be bringing us into. Let's continue in the story and think about maybe and glean from the other side, Pharaoh and the Egyptians. May not be our first choice of identification or comparison, but it's worth a look as we consider the systems that we as individuals participate in, right? Considering the relationships between people groups that we have both constructed and endured on this land and in this country, considering the numerous systemic realities that are accentuated within the pandemic, but also the strife of injustices and inequities that were a reality before the pandemic. So there's a reality that in part of the way that we have lived as individuals and as a people and in being community that actually do leave much to be desired, or in how we have operated as institutions, as systems that may be predominantly white, supremacist, heteronormative, and or patriarchal. A lot has taken place and has been endured and even swept by in some of these spaces. There's harm and missteps. There's unchecked inequality. There's imbalance, expectations assumes. There's stratified ways of value and care that get lived out. There's inclusion for some, but not for all. And yet still, there's always the hope, right, and the potential of possibility. A possibility that may find existence in new ways of being and becoming within the unknown that sits on this other side of the Red Sea. In the Exodus story, I saw that God was actually present with Pharaoh and the Egyptians. The number of times that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, allowing Pharaoh to actually become into the fullness of his own pride and defiance, unable to give up their way of life that they had grown accustomed to as Egyptians. Pharaoh said, "We have let the Israelites go and we have lost their services." So they fought for their way of life, but they did so not understanding this God of promise, of providence, of power and fight. And so after their pursuit, the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." And so I had to ask myself, like Pharaoh and the Egyptians, when have I become so self-focused, so set, accustomed to my way of life, yet disconnected to understanding who God is and what God has called into being according to God's kingdom? What is necessary that I may need to give up, to let go in order to bring me into a more full understanding of God? Like, what if I needed to learn to live differently? That will grow and further my understanding of God and who God is. As an institution, as a community, this may reflect in asking, are there things that we need to consider letting go of, changing, or learning to practice differently so that we might thrive better as a community, but so that all might thrive better in this community? These are stories of faithfulness, a God of promise, providence, fight, and power, the God with us. And our participation, though, in this faithfulness is not contrite. It is not without, or not to be lived without integrity and honesty, vulnerability, accountability, and justice. But it leads us into communion with each other. Faithfulness is our worship and how we practice community. And this faithfulness opens up new ways for practicing community, new ways for becoming community as repairers of the breach and restorers to the street. So being reminded of this faithfulness is about remembering, restoring, and rebuilding from the foundations of our people, our past, and the experience within these stories, especially in light of Black History Month as we think on this country. Remembering the faithfulness of others, but also the faithfulness of God, whom have been repairers in the breach and restorers to the streets. What strikes me is that there's so much in our present history that makes it hard to kind of obstruct what has been done and hard to move beyond the harm and hate that has been experienced. So much is worthy of our lament. And I know that last Sunday we talked a lot about lament, which is a great place to be and become in community through. But it's also so much a demonstration of faithfulness and the faithfulness of people and a God with us. And this came to me in terms of the reminder of this on Martin Luther King Day. And so I'm part of the MLK Prayer Breakfast Committee. And so I kind of think about and plan for MLK Day all year as we're on this committee. But in reflection during the weekend, kind of leading into MLK Day, I thought about the different ways that people enter into this holiday marked by remembrance. MLK traditions for some may be like the CME churchgoers, Christmas, Mother's Day, Easter, that they think about and participate in MLK things annually. There may be some that dig up a good MLK quote to share a post. And through this year, what kept popping into my feeds and what I was seeing in the social medias, I was seeing a lot from liberation leaders and friends who were calling for more everyday actions to match the reflected faith, spirit, and legacy of MLK. That this is not just to be for this day of recognition, but for every day. Bernice King posted on Dr. King's birthday on January 15th, said, "Today is your 94th birthday. Everything you could have said about the human condition and how to improve it, you said, with courageous action. Will we see in 2023 that honoring you equals more than statuses and quotes, in racism, all inhumane isms, eradicate poverty and militarism?" Another friend, Deborah Maston, posted, "Faith without works is dead, so is faithfully quoting MLK without following through with his work." So when I thought about how there are those that engage annually or partially, I thought about that for others, some like myself, MLK Day stands as a time to draw strength for a continual rebuilding of society and systems, to reroute with community for inspiration, encouragement, camaraderie, learning together, leaning in to the Spirit together to continue the work and fight that we are called into, this work and fight that so often we cannot escape. This work and fight that continues to be needed day in and day out, year after year after year. This is faithfulness, y'all. Being reminded of faithfulness is about community. It is about more than just me, because it is for community. It is the kingdom community, and knowing that the kingdom community is radically inclusive and continually works against injustice. So I listened to a few podcasts, and on the episode of one of the podcasts I listened to, Pass the Mic, which is hosted by Tyler Burns and Jamar Tisby, it follows one of the mediums under a Black collective that exists out there. And they were talking, and Tyler Burns said these words that kind of spoke to me in light of where we are today. And so he said, to work to change the foundations of the institutions, it takes much longer, harder work. But I think that is the work that God has called a lot of us to, in a way, though, that is uncomfortable. To get down and change the institution from the inside out, that's a beautiful, mysterious work that God breathes on in ways that people don't understand. God breathes on faithfulness. God breathes on it. God does something unique to the faithful. God does something unique for the faithful. He continued as he's talking about his posture and what it means for him to be in the midst of the fight, be in the midst and continue. He says, I don't want to take an opportunity. I want to bring people with me to an opportunity. And I don't want to just walk into a door. I want to walk into the door and hold it open. It's about more than me. That's community. He said, maybe the call for us, like Moses, is to actually carry the weight of the people, show them something they hadn't seen before. And frankly, they might grab you and pull you back and make you feel so overwhelmed that you might not see it yourself. But because you were faithful, people behind you will see what they wouldn't have been able to see if you weren't faithful. This faithfulness is for the sake of community, for the community now and for the community of future generations to come. Being reminded of faithfulness means actually building towards new ways of being and becoming community. It creates new ways for the kingdom. It calls on repairers and restorers to co-create with God about new possibilities. On an episode of the podcast Reclaiming My Theology, hosted by Brandy Miller, she had a guest, Jonathan Walton, coming on. And he said, the church does not have, in the same way we have no reentry program really for people who commit crimes, we don't have a way to welcome people back in. I feel like that's a little problematic. But we don't have a way to welcome people back in. We have ways to damn people. Exile, we are fine with. Excommunication, do it. But we have made grace so expensive that it is not real. When in reality, we must be willing to restore people to communities because God has restored us. It is literally the gospel. He talks further about being in community with different people, and one of the things that struck me as he talked about what it had meant to be with a particular person, he said, let me just be. Let me just be with this person the way that Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, the way that Jesus has been with me. And if he could do that, he said, it would just be a fundamentally different way of experiencing spirituality and the divine in this world. The way that God has been with Israelites, with Moses and Aaron, with MLK and our civil rights leaders, then and now. There's a faithfulness from God with us, whom learned to be with us in this divine in a divine way in this world, in fundamentally different ways than maybe we've actually experienced with each other. So I'm going to draw us back to the question I started with. If we know the God who is faithful, a God with us, then why are we so afraid to follow God and to change? And so I'm going to do something that may be uncomfortable. I'm going to leave you here in this space, unresolved, unknown, but knowing the faithfulness of Emmanuel, God with us, a God of the people. For it is us as a people whom participate into God's kingdom community. So the answer isn't the problem. We know what we are called to do. We know what we are told to do. Fast against injustice, loosen the chains of injustice, undo heavy burdens, right? Set the oppressed free and break every yoke. The question is, why aren't we doing it already? So let's practice faithfulness, building relationships and becoming a people together rather than perpetuating systems of bondage and resistance. And we can do so by becoming community together, but becoming new possibilities of community together, becoming new creation together as God's faithfulness. There's an author called Arthur Riley, who has an Instagram handle, Black Liturgist, and she creates beautiful liturgy and ways of reflecting by using breath prayers. And so that's how I want us to leave out this morning. She says, the oppressor can never be trusted as historian. Our task is preservation. Collective memory is a liberation practices. And so for a breath prayer, you just inhale together and then you exhale. But as you're inhaling, you're going to say specific words. And as you exhale, you're going to breathe out specific words. So can we do that together for practice? So inhale, our story is sacred. And exhale, memory is a compass. Again, inhale, our story is sacred. And exhale, memory is a compass. One more time. Inhale, our story. And exhale,